to embark on argument analysis, how we're going to unpack the parts of an argument and begin to evaluate the various constituents of the argument that we're interested in. So, in very general terms, the first thing we're going to do is figure out the point of the argument and what is it that the argument is trying to get us to think, or how is it attempting to change our decision making, etc. So what's the point of the thing I'm reading? And that's not always going to be so clear. Once we've identified the main contention or the conclusion of the argument, we're going to try and figure out, what are the assumptions underlying this argument. So some of the premises, of course, will be explicitly stated. Others we're going to have to do a little bit of work to discover. And then finally, we're going to try and evaluate the way the argument moves from the assumptions or the premises to the main contention. And ultimately, we're going to be able to evaluate those moves. But let's get started. So just as a sort of set of general rules of thumb, we can look at each sentence in the argument and ask some questions about it. So we could say, look, is this sentence a premise? Is this sentence just a point that's just introduced, asserted in order to get the argument started? Does the sentence state a widely shared assumption, or is it introducing factual evidence, etc.? These would be indicators that we're dealing with a premise. As we go on, we're going to be looking at sub-arguments, and sub-arguments would be attempts in the course of the argument to anticipate counter-arguments and to respond to possible objections. So we're going to ask, well, is this sentence in fact responding to an objection? And is the author then attempting to respond to possible counter-arguments? And then we're going to look for indications that there's some inferences taking place. So is this sentence that I'm reading right now derived from some previous sentence via some chain of reasoning? And then we could identify, we could say, well, has the author made an inference of some sort? And can we tell how she's made the inference? Those are all questions we're going to be asking ourselves as we read. Is the sentence stating a conclusion? Well, that would be handy. If the sentence explicitly states the conclusion or the main contention, that would be great. But do remember that it's possible that the point of the argument is never explicitly stated anywhere in the argument. And this is actually normal or relatively frequent. It's certainly not an unusual circumstance for the thesis never to actually get stated. Okay, so what we're going to do is look at an example. This is on the screen, what we have here, you might want to make this full screen if you're looking in the thumbnail mode. What we have here is, in its entirety, an editorial from the New York Times from a couple of years back, from 2001. And what I'd like you to do at this point is pause the video and read the article. So if you're in the online course, you'll find a link to the original nicely formatted article in Blackboard. But in any event, you don't need to go back and look at that. You could just pause here and read the article. Read the article with these questions in mind. Do your best first to identify the conclusion. So this would be the point to pause. Okay, so I hope you've had a chance to pause the video, read the editorial, and I hope you've tried to determine what you think the point of this short piece is. If you haven't, or well, maybe you have, I think here this would be the principal purpose of the article, of the editorial. The editorial is trying to convince us that Obama should hang tough, meaning he should press vigorously for the emission standards or the fuel efficiency standards that the editorial writers of the Times are in favor of. So okay, so maybe you didn't find that conclusion or that main contention. If you didn't find the main contention, what I'd like you to do is think about why what you picked out might not have been, or I guess wasn't, the main contention of the piece. So consider it. So for example, let's say if you thought that the main contention had to do with the stickers. Let's see. So you might, for example, have thought labels can help consumers make better choices. Why isn't that the main contention of this piece? So why isn't it about stickers or labels? Think about that for a little bit. Okay, so or perhaps you had another, you found another main contention, but think about what the function of that particular sentence that you identified as the main contention was. It might also be the case that you identified some contention or conclusion that isn't explicitly stated here. Well, I mean, in some sense, the conclusion or the sentence "Obama should hang tough" is not a fully articulated expression of the thesis here, right? So it's not by itself, it's not fully clear, but presumably that captures the intention of the editorial writers in this case. Next, what I'd like to do is look at some of the reasons given. So why do they think that Obama should vigorously press for these new fuel emission standards? What are their reasons? So at this point, I'd like you to pause the video and identify 3 or 4 reasons, sentences that count as reasons for supporting the conclusion. Okay, so now you're back. Let's take a look. So there's a bunch here that we could point to, but what I've done is I've identified what I think are the principal reasons underlying the editorial writer's reasoning. So they believe, for example, that industry needs to do better, and they say industry clearly needs to do better. They write that Detroit and other manufacturers need to be forced to do better. They won't make changes unless they're forced to do them. Okay. Let's look further. There's very little prospect for serious energy legislation coming out of Capitol Hill. And so the new emission standards, or fuel efficiency standards rather, represent President Obama's most promising opportunity to make significant reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, etc. And then finally, I guess, restating the earlier claim that industry needs to do better, is this claim that now's the chance for him to push automakers to do even better. I mean, in some sense, this could also be identified as a conclusion or a main contention, but and that it's a restatement, really, of the Obama should hang tough point. So we know in general terms what they're trying to say here, and we can see some of the reasons that they use to support their argument. Now, it's really important for you to recognize, or for all of us to recognize, that most of what's presented here is not actually, how will we put it, operative in the structure of the argument. It's not actually playing a role in the structure of the argument. I mean, when we read things like lots of happy talk accompanied the Obama's blah blah blah, new fuel stickers, blah blah blah, I mean, we could see much of this as not really contributing, maybe setting the stage, etc., not really contributing to the core argument here. So one could imagine a good exercise is to take an opposing position and to consider what an opponent of increased regulation of fuel efficiency standards would regard as a response to these points. Now, in fairness, the editorial writers do consider some objections. They consider, I think, at least I've identified, two objections. So the first is the objection that, with current technology, it's going to be difficult to achieve these kinds of things. And second, that cars will end up costing more if these new standards are put in place. So these would count as two objections, and in fairness again to the editorial writers, they attempt to respond to those two objections. So what we're going to do, this was just an initial example of a real-life case where we have an argument and we really have very little in the way of actual argument or inference going on here. The job for you at this point is to try and identify, the exercise for you at this point is to try and identify an inference or two from this editorial where we can see the writers moving from a premise to some more advanced stage in the argument. So why don't you, in discussion, identify, sorry, not in discussion, as your assignment. Your assignment will be, so you can email this to me, your assignment will be to indicate two inferences that move the argument forward. Okay, thanks.